All right, my 2 minutes, my provocation, trying to find a way into this topic that I think helps us to see our role as designers. My proposition is that cities are essentially concentrators of energy, by which I also mean wealth. And I do not just mean consumption, because it's taken for granted that cities consume huge amounts of resources, but in fact that they are sitting at the pinnacle of production hierarchies. I'm pointing to the classic food chain by which solar energy is concentrated first by plants, then in herbivores, then in carnivores, and so on up the chain. This is something in ecology textbooks everywhere. And what we mean by concentration is that top of the food chain only exists because the rest of it continues to function successfully and is therefore of that higher quality. Next slide, please. This also, however, is far from just a mere physical attribute, and in fact, I think this is one of the major themes of this event, that this concentration of energy, of capacity to do things, exists within, I would say, social, political, economic, cultural spheres. I'm simply waving my hand at some graphs here that stand among many, looking at the ways in which the economics of agglomeration cause, the simplest way to say it is, the best and the brightest to move to cities. And each one of those innovative individuals, the products that they produce and so forth that are drawn to ever larger cities, represent a further concentration of the resources that are on which they're based. Next, please. So if we look at the overall diagram, right, the cities of the pre-modern period up to whatever that is, the early 19th century, they existed solely by concentrating the renewable energies that fell on the surface of the earth. So look at London in 1825, about 1 million people. It existed in that size by concentrating essentially the agricultural wealth that it had managed to capture, both through colonization and through trading. The cities that we now call cities, which are really gigantic metropolises, they exist in their sizes by having added to that base the huge inputs, the ones we were just hearing described here, those 100 million barrels a day of oil. Those resources are what it made possible for contemporary cities to grow to their size. Next, please. So rather than just leave you with a proposition about concentration, I wanted to perhaps turn this around to the kind of question that I think we are asking collectively. And this is looking maybe not 50 years, but maybe even 100 years out. What does it take? How many resources does it take to actually support a contemporary city? Next, please. This is not my chart. There are a number of people many people actually, who've been working on this kind of question. And if we take seriously those production chains, that huge set of processes of concentration on which contemporary cities sit, they sit at the pinnacle of those. Typical city, older city, anywhere from 50 to 100 times the amount of renewable resources that fall on its area, and that's if you converted all of them into usable form, which is not possible. So typical city uses 50 to 100 times. Cities have always done this, 5 times, 10 times. But now we look at cities like Beijing, and nobody has done this for Manhattan yet, but you look at Beijing, and in the early 2000s, it was using over 500 times the amount of resources that fall on its area in order to fuel its growth. So when we ask this question, what does it take to make the transition, we're asking, how does one make the transition back to something like one? Next, please. And ultimately, because we are looking at this from the position of having a certain quality of life, having a certain flow of resources, a certain scale of city, we're asking the question backwards. We're asking the question, how do I fuel this thing that has grown with these incredibly cheap fuels? How do I fuel this thing by switching over to these much more diffuse forms of environmental energies, which we have to go to a tremendous amount of work to concentrate? And so we see, this is actually a real photograph, a farmer discovering that it's cheaper for him to put PVs on his farmland than it was for him to pursue the agricultural activities he pursued previously. That may work for one farmer, but as a strategy for land use or for the fueling of cities, it is an impossible equation. Last slide, please. So I leave this with, if cities are concentrators of energy, and our task is to think how to do this with renewable sources of energy, what we are asking is a question that is as old as cities themselves. What is the relationship of cities to their regions? And at some point, whether it's in 50 years or 100 years, what we are asking about is how do we develop cities and their extended infrastructures that work within the renewable resources that flow through that area. What I'm calling here the environmental loading ratio of 1, and just suggesting an example we're looking at right now, how big of a region does it take to support a city of a certain size? Thank you, and I will turn to my colleagues and see if they have any questions. I think I did leave some time.
Sure, I can start maybe.
Please.
Yeah. I wonder whether you're certain that the city is also the right scale of analysis, because I think there was some very interesting work I saw recently out of a researcher at the University of Maryland looking at an idea called an anthrome, which is some kind of hybrid, kind of artificial, natural kind of assemblage. And they were doing quite interesting work trying to understand, let's say, like more concretely, these flows of energy and waste, etc., through these different kinds of systems. And it strikes me that the city is a very big thing and also very, very difficult to define. You have places like, like, are we talking about an African city? We're talking about an American city, a European city, an Asian city as well. Actually, they're very, very different kinds of beasts. So I wonder, about this kind of frame of analysis and the idea of the city and whether you think that's actually the right way to pose the problem.
Well, actually, I mean, obviously, one answer is that everybody who talks about cities argues about what is a city.
Yeah.
I mean, what are its limits and its extents? And even from the earliest cities, the idea that there was a defined region for each city is nonsense because of the trading networks, and obviously now with global.
Yeah.
So, but turn it around the other way. We all recognize a city when we're in one. We recognize it as we approach and leave them. So the tremendous concentrations of population and talent and jobs, you could say that we are a city building species. And so that is I think, maybe to put my point a little bit more simply, I think that's the scale at which we better ask this question about how we should think about using renewable resources.
Although I think I would argue with you a bit on how you define a city, and particularly argue with you on this slide right here. It's defining it in relationship to property. And so if you think about where you recognize a city, you're recognizing property and you're recognizing jurisdiction. Yeah. You're recognizing building form. What you're not recognizing is the scale of an energy system or the scale of different ecological systems, even the scale of human behavioral systems. They don't follow property boundaries. Right. Only the city itself might follow a property boundary. And I think it's a really interesting mismatch for us as we try to do so much of our analysis through a spatial relationship as opposed to a physical relationship dealing with the physical systems themselves.
Well, I would agree, and this diagram is nothing more than a diagram, and I have friends who would argue that watershed is the natural proper boundary for regions. But I think the question which I was trying to underline is, once we start asking about renewable energy systems, as opposed to the essentially mining-based systems which are tapping stored fuels, the minute you shift to renewables, you are talking about areas of collection and concentration. And so for me, that's the moment it stops becoming a question of what do I want in a city and how big do I think it should be for other reasons, but what's the trade-off between the amount of area I need to grow food, the amount of area I need to grow fuel for automobiles, the amount of area I need to put photovoltaics in order to produce electricity. Suddenly we're talking about huge areas. And if we simply imagine unplugging today's buildings or cities and plugging them into area-based collection systems, then we have we're talking about a different system, and we have then a different or perhaps a familiar problem, which actually does, I think, ultimately go to some form of control of land. Yes? Yeah.
I'm not an architect, I'm a filmmaker.
Good.
Nothing
Good.
I have a decent amount of experience in I should be doing this, right?
Oh, we should all should.
Can you hear me better? Yeah. Sorry. My name is Rachel. I'm a filmmaker. I don't have any experience in your department. I do have a decent amount of experience in places like Nigeria and cities like Lagos.
Yeah.
Electricity doesn't work there. Just doesn't work. turns off multiple times a day. When I was working there, apps were not particularly popular. Everybody had older cell phones, but we used to turn them on and just kind of continue whatever conversation was going on by the light of all of our cell phones, and then keep going with our day when the generator would turn back on. This was normal. This happened 20 times a day. I think that's not so unusual in underdeveloped places where electricity isn't necessarily something that's provided, and consumption is really an issue of how do I get the fuel to operate my generator? How am I going to have electricity so that my lights don't turn off so I can continue my workday in my office? But it's a very individual problem that literally household by household is being dealt with. How does something like that fit into your framework?
Well,
that again, kind of reality.
I can't. The perfect question, and my provocation wasn't meant to solve all the problems, but in fact, describe them. But I do think one of the things that's interesting about a place like Nigeria, which I have not been to, is the degree to which, yes, it's almost exactly what I wrote on the slide here, but didn't actually say, which is I think a way to describe our problem is how do we imagine a 21st century city using more or less the 18th century resource base that we had previously, which Nigeria does have a lot of oil.
What does that mean?
That means virtually no oil, no gas, no coal.
But we have such different machines today. How does that?
Exactly. So in other words, the question isn't going back to pre-modern agricultural forms of living, although that's of course always an option. But in
unlikely.
fact, well, it's not a choice, I suppose, would be that anybody wants to make. But I think what's interesting about places, anything other than the wealthy world, which is not consuming at anything like the rates that we're talking about when I show these examples. Many of those places, and I don't know Nigeria directly, have in a sense been leapfrogging less efficient, messier technologies that exist in the wealthy world. They're still not all working, but the cell phone you cited is a perfect example. Jumping from a wired system to a wireless system, also not having run up to the massive levels of consumption, they are in a position potentially to choose less intensive systems. So again, when I say that cities concentrate power, I think that's true of every city. A city in an agricultural economy is the place in which the wealth of that region is concentrated, however well or badly. And so this isn't a comment on whether that's a successful strategy or not.